My dad threw me out over a secret. 15 years later they came to my door and... My name is Sarah Jessica. I'm 34 years old, a working photographer living in Seattle, and I haven't spoken to my family in 15 years. I remember the sound of the front door closing behind me, like it happened yesterday, not because it was loud, but because it was final. That silence just after the lock turned was the most deafening thing I'd ever heard. People think being disowned is always explosive, but the truth is it's often quiet, almost polite, cold like a formal goodbye. The night my father threw me out over a secret, he never tried to understand. He didn't yell. He just handed me a suitcase that wasn't even mine and told me to be out before dark. I was 19, terrified, and 12 weeks pregnant with a child whose father was dying. Back then, I worked as an assistant at a pediatric arts therapy center fresh out of high school, unsure if I wanted to pursue design or nursing. I lived at home with my parents, both esteemed figures in Seattle's medical community. My father, Dr. Peter Jessica, was chief of surgery at a major hospital and loved by everyone except the people closest to him. My mother, Eleanor, was the textbook definition of composed, always well-dressed, soft-spoken, never without her pearls or her silence. My older brother, Noah, was a rising star in cardiothoracic surgery, the perfect heir to the Jessica name. Then there was me. I didn't fit the mold, but I tried. I studied hard, volunteered at the children's hospital, and never missed Sunday dinner. Still, I always felt like a placeholder in a family portrait I was never really part of. The secret that ended everything wasn't the pregnancy. Not really, it was who the father was. Gabriel Carter was 25, a freelance photographer who had once been my father's patient after surviving a rare heart condition. We met at the hospital's charity gala, where I was working the check-in table and he was photographing donors. He had a crooked smile and a calm way of asking questions that made me forget to protect myself. We spent hours talking about light childhood memories and the way certain silences say more than words. Gabe lived modestly in a converted art studio and taught photography classes to teens on weekends. He had been diagnosed with a degenerative heart disorder a few months before we met, and he was undergoing experimental treatments funded in part by the hospital where my father worked. We didn't fall in love quickly. It happened slowly, like light filling a dark room. Gabe wasn't reckless. Neither was I. But when he told me there was a chance he might not make it to 30, he said it not to scare me but to be honest. He didn't want pity. He just wanted to leave something good behind. One evening, sitting on the rooftop of his studio, wrapped in a worn blanket and watching the city lights shimmer off the water, he told me that if his health declined, he wanted to know a part of him would live on. It wasn't impulsive or dramatic. We spent weeks talking about it, what it would mean, what it would take, what we would give up. I wasn't naive. I knew it would mean risking everything. I just didn't expect to lose it all so quickly. I had planned to tell my parents after Gabe's next treatment cycle, when he was strong enough to come with me and answer their inevitable questions. I didn't get that chance. My brother found a prescription bottle in my bag while looking for something harmless and confronted me in the kitchen while my parents listened silently. At first I lied, said it was for a friend, but Noah always was too smart for his own good. When I confessed I was pregnant and that the father was Gabe Carter, their reaction wasn't concern. It was calculation. My father stood still for a moment, then told me, without blinking, that if I insisted on keeping the baby, I would need to leave. Not tomorrow, not after thinking it through, but that night. I tried to explain about Gabe's illness, about our plans, about how careful we'd been. My mother said nothing. My brother said I was ruining everything our family had built. My father said I had made my choice. I asked if I could stay one more week to figure out a plan. He shook his head. You forfeited your place the moment you decided to throw your future away. That was the last full sentence he ever said to me. By morning, I was sleeping in my car with a packed duffel bag, $300 in savings, and a trembling body I was now responsible for. I didn't even get to say goodbye to Gabe in person that week. He was recovering from a collapsed lung, and I didn't want to add to his pain. I told him I was staying with a friend for a while. He offered to send money, but he barely had enough for his own medication. That week was the first time I tasted fear in a way that didn't just sting, it stayed with me, seeped into my bones. It was also the first time I realized I wasn't going to be rescued by anyone. I wasn't the girl my family had raised. I was the woman they'd erased. I didn't cry the first night. I sat in the back seat of my car, parked outside the old community library 2 miles from my parents' house, too afraid to move and too numb to feel anything. My body ached from the awkward position, and my mind couldn't stop replaying the way my mother turned her face away as I begged for more time. I had always imagined that if I ever disappointed them, at least she would intervene, that she would step between my father and me, and say something, anything, even if it was quiet. But her silence had been louder than any punishment. It told me exactly where I stood in the family I once thought was mine. For the next 3 days, I stayed in that car. I changed in gas station bathrooms, survived on protein bars and water, and kept telling myself I just needed to figure out the next 48 hours. I knew I couldn't stay parked in the same spot forever, and eventually I drove to the one place I thought no one would look for me, the empty parking lot behind the art therapy center where I used to work part-time. I still had my ID badge, and the center didn't open until late morning. I slept there during the night and snuck into the staff restroom to freshen up before disappearing again before opening hours. It was a fragile rhythm, but it gave me a tiny sense of control. Every morning I told myself one simple thing: just keep the baby safe. That was the only job that mattered now. I didn't tell Gabe the truth until the end of that first week. He called from the hospital still groggy from his recent procedure, asking how I was and when he could see me. I hated lying to him, but I also didn't want to put another weight on his chest. Finally, I told him I had been kicked out and was staying with a friend for a while. His voice cracked when he offered to leave the hospital and come find me, but I knew he wasn't physically strong enough to help me, not in the state he was in. Just get stronger, I whispered. That's all I need from you right now. We both knew it was a half-truth, but neither of us said so out loud. My break came by accident. One morning, while I was sitting on a bench near the park, eating a plain bagel, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a floral scarf sat beside me. She looked over and said, "You've got that look." I didn't respond at first, unsure if she was talking to me. "Like someone who's running low on plans," she added gently. Her name was Ruby Feldman. She lived in the duplex across the street from the park and had spent 30 years as a public school teacher. Without pressing for too many details, she offered me a place to sleep. "It's a pull-out couch and I've got too many houseplants, but it's warm and clean." I was hesitant. I didn't want pity. But she said something that stayed with me. "Everyone falls through the cracks. The question is whether anyone's there to catch them." Moving into Ruby's home didn't solve everything, but it gave me space to breathe. She had an extra blanket folded perfectly at the end of the sofa and a framed picture of her late husband on the side table. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon tea and old wood. There was no pressure, no questions. I wasn't ready to answer, just quiet kindness. I told her the basics: pregnant, disowned, the father was sick, and she didn't flinch. She simply nodded and asked if I wanted help finding work. I applied to every job I could find, but being visibly pregnant and 19 meant most doors stayed closed. After 2 weeks, a local photo printing shop called back. The owner needed someone to help with customer orders and packaging. It paid minimum wage, but the hours were steady, and the back room had a chair where I could rest when the nausea got bad. Meanwhile, Gabe's condition was declining. His doctors had tried switching to a different medication, but the side effects were brutal. We talked every other day, sometimes for hours, other times for only a few minutes. He had started writing letters to our unborn child, one for every milestone he thought he might miss. He mailed them to Ruby's address with simple labels: first day of school, learning to ride a bike, heartbreak, number 1. I kept them all in a box under the couch, too scared to open them but too grateful to let them go. At night, Ruby and I would sit in the living room watching the local news, and she'd share quiet stories about the students she used to teach, kids who grew up to surprise everyone, or kids who didn't make it. She never offered advice unless I asked. When I finally broke down one night and admitted how terrified I was to give birth alone, she reached over and said, "It's not the worst thing you know. Being alone. The worst thing is thinking you have people, and realizing they were never really yours." That winter was harsh. Money was always tight. I often skipped meals to save for prenatal vitamins and bus fare to the doctor's office. Ruby helped however she could, slipping extra soup into the pot or pretending she didn't notice when I borrowed detergent. Some nights I stared at the ceiling and wondered if my child would grow up asking why he didn't have grandparents, why his father wasn't around, and whether I'd be enough for both of us. But every time he kicked even faintly, I reminded myself that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. By the time I entered my 3rd trimester, Gabe's condition had deteriorated to the point where phone calls exhausted him. We moved to short voice notes, sometimes just a sentence or two, his breath ragged between words, but his tone always gentle. He started signing them off with, "Tell our little light I'm proud already." I saved every recording, every message. It became part of my nightly ritual to listen to one hand on my stomach whispering back that we were waiting for him. But we both knew, even if we didn't say it aloud, that he might not make it in time. Ruby offered to take me to the hospital every week for checkups, and even when she was tired or limping slightly from arthritis, she never let me carry the weight of her help. She started making space in her house for baby things, folding bassinet sheets, organizing kitchen drawers for bottles I hadn't even bought yet. I wanted to believe we had more time. I convinced myself that if I just stayed calm, if I just followed every doctor's instruction, maybe the universe would make an exception. But life doesn't grant exceptions. It just moves forward with or without your consent. The night Gabe died was clear and unusually warm for February. I had just finished writing in my journal when my phone buzzed. It wasn't him but his mother. I picked up, and from the moment I heard her voice I knew. She didn't need to say it, but she did anyway, softly, like breaking something already cracked. He passed peacefully, she told me. In his sleep. Holding a photo of me at our first park date where I wore a scarf that kept slipping off, and he said I looked like I'd wandered out of a painting. I dropped the phone and sat on the edge of Ruby's couch, not crying, not moving, just breathing. That was the hardest part, remembering how to breathe without him. The following morning, Ruby made cinnamon tea and placed a hand on my shoulder before heading to work. She didn't offer words. She just let me grieve. In silence, in solitude, the way only people who have known deep loss understand. I spent the day sorting through the things Gabe had left for me. The letters. The small velvet box I hadn't dared open. The stack of developed film rolls labeled with months instead of events, like they were his way of saying time mattered more than titles. That night I opened the box. Inside was a necklace with a pendant shaped like a leaf, the same leaf he had once photographed stuck in a chain-link fence, which he said reminded him of me. Rooted, and still reaching for light, he'd told me then. I wore it for the rest of my pregnancy. I gave birth 2 weeks later, alone in a delivery room lit by cold overhead bulbs and the beeping of monitors. Ruby waited just outside, pacing nervously with a bag of snacks she would forget to eat. The labor was long and grueling. There was no one to hold my hand, no one to breathe with me. But when Liam entered the world screaming and red-faced, everything else blurred. He had Gabe's eyes. Deep, quiet eyes that made me want to tell him everything, even if he couldn't yet understand a word. I held him to my chest and whispered, "He would have loved you so much." We stayed in the hospital for 3 days. Ruby brought me fresh clothes, helped fill out paperwork, and called Gabe's parents for me when I couldn't stop shaking. They asked to fly in, but their finances had been drained by his treatment, and I didn't want them to see me like that, half-healed, hollow-eyed, grieving and glowing all at once. I promised them I would send photos. I took the first one with Liam, curled in my arms, wearing the blanket Ruby had knitted from leftover yarn. His name was written on the little whiteboard next to my bed, Liam Gabriel Jessica. I remember thinking as I stared at that board in the dark at 3 a.m., that this was the first night I was truly alone in the world, but somehow also not. We returned to Ruby's house the following week. She had transformed the corner of her guest room into a nursery with a thrifted rocking chair and walls taped with quiet encouragements. Strong mothers raise strong children. Gentle doesn't mean weak. I couldn't afford to stay off work long, so she helped watch Liam while I went back to the Photoshop. Money was thin, and there were nights when I had to choose between formula and gas. I cried sometimes in the supply closet between shifts, but I never cried in front of Liam. I needed him to see steadiness, to learn that survival wasn't always graceful, but it was always possible. I mailed a photo of Liam to my parents with nothing else, no note, no explanation, just his face in a blue onesie, eyes wide open. I don't know what I expected. Maybe silence, maybe a miracle. What I got was a returned envelope 2 weeks later, unopened. My mother's handwriting in the corner slanting slightly. Returned to sender. That was the moment I knew I couldn't hope for them anymore. Whatever came next, it would have to come from me. Liam was 3 months old when I reached the edge of exhaustion. Ruby had returned to teaching part-time at the local community center, and though she tried to split her days with me, the truth was we were both running on fumes. I worked 6 days a week, early mornings at the Photoshop, and late evenings cleaning offices for a small janitorial company that didn't ask too many questions. Most nights I'd rock Liam to sleep with my shoes still on, whispering stories I made up just to keep my brain from drowning in the dullness of survival. Sometimes I didn't recognize my own voice anymore. It sounded flat, like a dial tone stretched too long. Still, I kept going. There wasn't time to fall apart. When you're a single mom with no backup, no one shows up if you break. Bills don't wait. Babies don't understand. And grief doesn't disappear just because you're tired of carrying it. I found comfort in small rituals. I wore Gabe's pendant every day, polished Liam's bottles before each shift, and folded Ruby's laundry whenever she forgot. That's how we survived. Not with big moves or miracles, but with quiet consistency. One afternoon, while Liam napped in a makeshift bassinet in the corner of the print shop, I noticed a familiar name in the order queue: Dr. Peter Jessica. My father. My hands froze on the keyboard. For a second, I wondered if he had found out where I was. But the address didn't match their old house. It was a hospital order headshots for a medical conference presentation. The delivery wasn't urgent, but something in me stirred. I clicked the order open just to confirm it was really him, and that's when I saw it. Among the reference files was a folder titled G. Carter Vertical Bar, Research Trip Archive. It held over 70 scanned photographs. I recognized them immediately. Gabe had taken them during his final funded trip through the Andes Mountains with my father's medical research group back when he was still strong enough to hike. I'd never seen them published. Most were of local families' makeshift health clinics, and candid portraits of children being treated in remote villages. One photo caught my breath. A shot of Gabe crouching beside an elderly man, both laughing under a bright blue tarp as rain poured in the background. I remembered that tarp. He once told me it collapsed right after the picture, soaking them both but giving him his favorite memory of the trip. Without thinking, I copied the file name and checked the metadata. It listed Gabe as the primary rights holder. That meant technically the images belonged to him, or now to Liam and me. For the first time in months, I felt something flicker beneath the weight I'd been carrying. Not revenge, not opportunity, but the seed of something I thought I'd buried: purpose. I spent the next week printing a selection of the photos at night, carefully restoring the color tones Gabe loved, matching his signature style. I didn't know what I was going to do with them yet, but I knew I couldn't let them disappear into another glossy hospital pamphlet with no story behind them. These images weren't just files. They were proof that Gabe had lived fully, that his art had meaning, that he hadn't faded quietly no matter what my family had believed. Ruby encouraged me to submit the set to a local community gallery that offered monthly showcases for first-time artists. I almost didn't do it. I didn't consider myself an artist. Just someone who had touched a camera once through the man she loved. But Ruby insisted. She even helped me write the submission letter and picked the title for the series, The Unseen. When the gallery curator called 2 weeks later to say they'd accepted it for the spring show, I didn't react, not at first. I just sat there holding Liam in one arm, the phone in the other, listening to a stranger tell me that something I had carried in silence now had a place in the world. In the months leading up to the show, I worked nights organizing prints and writing Gabe's story to accompany each piece. The gallery offered a modest stipend and covered printing costs. It wasn't much, but it gave me a reason to keep pushing. I used the money to buy Liam a proper crib and to pay for Ruby's leaky sink to be fixed. I sent an email to Gabe's parents with pictures of the installation plan. Ellen replied with 3 heart emojis and a line that still makes me tear up: "He would be proud of you, and not just for this." What struck me most during those months wasn't the gallery or the show itself, but the shift that happened inside me. I started looking people in the eye again. I stopped bracing for rejection every time someone asked if Liam's father was in the picture. I no longer flinched at the word family. I didn't have one in the traditional sense, but I had built something else. A network of quiet resilience patched together from kindness and persistence. The night before the opening, I stood alone in the gallery, placing the last card under Gabe's favorite photo. The walls were filled with his work, his vision, his memory, but the space felt like mine. Like a beginning, not just a tribute. I looked down at Liam in his stroller, fast asleep, cheeks flushed, breathing steady. This was for him too. A father he'd never meet, a mother who almost didn't make it, and a future built from everything we had lost. The night of the exhibition arrived like a quiet wave, not with fanfare but with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. I dressed Liam in a navy button-up onesie with tiny sneakers that made him look older than his age. I wore black, simple, clean, with the pendant Gabe gave me resting against my collarbone. Ruby insisted on coming early to help, and while she fussed over the placement of the guestbook and adjusted the lighting on one of the corner frames, I took a moment to just breathe. For once, I wasn't anticipating a disaster. I wasn't holding my breath for someone to cancel or withdraw. The gallery smelled faintly of fresh paint and dust, and outside the windows the sky shifted to a soft gray as evening settled in. People trickled in slowly at first. Friends of the gallery, a few coworkers from the photo shop, one of Ruby's old students who now worked as a journalist for a local paper. They walked the space with quiet reverence, pausing at each image, reading the notes I had written in Gabe's voice, his story unfolding not as a tragedy but as an honest reflection of hope through hardship. I stood near the back, not drawing attention, just watching. Liam slept most of the time, oblivious to the significance of the night. His stroller sat beside me, tucked beneath one of Gabe's final images, a photo of a young boy sitting on the steps of a clinic, staring directly into the lens with a half-smile and eyes that looked too wise for his age. A woman approached me near the end of the night, dressed in a sharp blazer, glasses perched low on her nose. She introduced herself as Marla Carson, curator at a small but respected nonprofit gallery downtown. She asked if I had more work, if I would consider submitting a pitch for a long-term exhibit that blended storytelling and photography with social impact. I was stunned. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I told her the photos were Gabe's, not mine. She nodded and said, "Yes, but the lens was his. The narrative is yours. You carried this into the world." Her words stayed with me long after the guests left and the lights dimmed. That night, after Ruby had gone home and Liam was tucked into his crib, I stood in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, staring at a crack in the wall that had always been there. I thought about the life I had imagined with Gabe, the one we never got to finish, and how different this path had become. But somehow, in all its brokenness, it felt more mine than anything I had ever planned. The next morning, the journalist who attended posted a feature in the local culture section. It was modest, just 3 paragraphs and 2 photos, but it carried weight. The Unseen: A Story of Loss, Legacy and Light. It included my full name, a brief mention of Gabe's connection to a medical research expedition, and a quote where I'd said, "Sometimes grief becomes the shape of your strength." I didn't think much of it until 3 days later, when I opened my email and saw a message I hadn't expected to ever receive. The subject line read, "From Noah." I clicked it, heart racing. It was short, just a few lines. "We saw the article. Mom cried when she recognized Liam in the photo. Dad hasn't said much, but I wanted you to know we're thinking about you. About him. And about everything we didn't try to understand back then. I don't know if it matters now. But if you ever wanted to talk, I'd listen." I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no apology, no explanation, just a crack in the wall that had separated us for 15 years. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. But something shifted after that email. A week later, a card arrived in the mailbox, addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a note that read, "He looks just like you did at that age. We were wrong. I hope you'll let us meet him someday." I held the card in my hand for hours, unsure what to feel. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't make up for the nights I spent crying in parking lots or the birthdays Gabe missed. But it did something else. It reminded me that people can carry regret even in silence. That pride doesn't always protect us from the damage we cause. I showed the card to Ruby, who said nothing at first, then quietly added, "Only you get to decide how far they come back into your life." I didn't make a decision right away. I spent the following weeks working on the submission packet for Marla Carson's gallery. I titled the next collection Afterlight. It was still about Gabe, but more than that, it was about Liam. About what comes after grief, after rejection, after everything collapses. And about how healing isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it just begins with letting yourself be seen again. I didn't reply to the card or the email for almost a month. I told myself I was too busy preparing for the next gallery opening, too exhausted raising Liam, while juggling freelance projects and late-night edits. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid that if I let them in, I'd undo everything I had rebuilt. That I'd fall back into needing their approval, only to find their love still came with terms. I had learned to live without them, to stop waiting for apologies that never came. But part of me, the part that still remembered my father's laugh on Sunday mornings or the scent of my mother's garden after it rained, still wanted something I couldn't name. The new gallery show opened on a Thursday evening 3 years after Liam was born. The space was larger, the crowd more diverse, and this time, the story was mine. Gabe's work had been the entry point, but now the narrative had shifted. Afterlight explored the emotional architecture of single motherhood memory and the unseen weight of silence. I had photographed empty high chairs, late-night grocery lists, the space beside a crib where a partner should have stood. I layered the prints with handwritten notes, real fragments from journals I had kept during those early years. The exhibit was raw, vulnerable, but not angry. It was a quiet statement that survival isn't always loud. Liam ran between people's legs, curious, and completely unaware that his life was on the walls. Ruby came with her cane and her calm presence, keeping a careful eye on him while I stood near the corner, pretending to adjust a frame that didn't need fixing. I was speaking with a woman from the City Arts Commission when I noticed 3 figures standing quietly near the entrance. I didn't recognize them right away, not until the older man shifted his weight and leaned heavily on a cane I had seen before. My stomach dropped. My father, my mother, and Noah standing slightly behind them, scanning the room with uncertain eyes. They didn't approach immediately. They just stood there reading the first plaque near the gallery entrance where I had written, "Every silence is an inheritance we didn't ask for." I didn't move. My hands were steady, but my chest ached in a way I hadn't felt since the day Liam was born. Part of me wanted to run to protect myself from whatever they had come to say or not say. But I stayed still. Let them come. Let them carry the weight this time. It was my mother who walked over first. Her hair had gone gray, but she still wore the same pearl earring she had the night they sat me down and told me I had to leave. Her voice was soft, almost unsure. Your work is haunting. Beautiful. Painful but beautiful. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She searched my face for a reaction, then said, I never stopped thinking about you. About what we did. I wanted to call so many times, but I didn't know if I had the right. My father stood a few steps behind, gripping his cane with both hands. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not just older, but reduced. As if the years had carved away at the man who once ordered me out of his house without looking back. He didn't speak at first, just nodded slowly when our eyes met, then said, We were wrong. That was it. 3 words, not rehearsed, not defensive, just quiet. I didn't know what I had been expecting, an explanation maybe, or tears, but those 3 words held more than I was ready for. I nodded once, not in forgiveness but in recognition. He had finally said what should have been said years ago. Noah approached last, holding Liam's coat in one hand. I hadn't even noticed my son had wandered toward them. He stood beside my brother, staring up with wide eyes. This is Liam, Noah asked gently. He looks just like Gabe. I felt my throat tighten. The name hadn't been spoken by anyone in my family since the day they erased him from my future. Yes, I replied. He has his eyes. And his heart. That night, after the gallery closed and the last guest had left, I sat on a bench outside while Liam napped in the car and the streetlight flickered overhead. My parents hadn't asked for anything. They hadn't begged for a relationship, or tried to rewrite history. They had simply shown up, seen the truth, and sat with it. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe nothing. Maybe something small. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to carry the whole story alone. I watched the city slow down around me, the way it always did after midnight. And I thought about how strange healing can be. It doesn't arrive like a revelation. It creeps in quietly through gestures you don't expect, through apologies that take 15 years and the loss of too much time to surface. It doesn't erase the years, but it softens their grip. And sometimes that's enough. In the weeks that followed the gallery opening, my parents didn't push. There were no sudden visits, no awkward phone calls, just a few carefully written postcards that arrived every 10 days or so. One showed a photo of a beach we once vacationed at when I was a child. Another had my mother's handwriting on the back, saying she'd started volunteering at the hospital again, this time in pediatrics. There was no mention of the past. Just small pieces of their present offered like olive branches. I didn't know if they were trying to rebuild something or simply trying to not disappear again. I didn't reply to all of them, but I didn't throw them away either. Liam was starting preschool, and for the first time in years, I had long mornings to myself. I used them to work on a personal photography project called Witness, a visual memoir of single-parent households in the city. I interviewed mothers and fathers who had been left behind by death, by divorce, by families who called their children mistakes. The project was raw and difficult, but it gave me clarity. I wasn't alone, not in my grief, not in my survival, and certainly not in my rebuilding. One morning, while sorting through the submissions for a grant proposal, I received an email from the pharmaceutical foundation that had once supported Gabe's treatment. They had launched a national initiative to fund community healing centers in memory of patients whose cases contributed to breakthrough trials. Attached to the message was a draft document with Gabe's name in bold: Gabriel Carter, Phase 2, subject year of death, 2012. They offered to fund a community creative space in his name, provided I agreed to oversee the planning and curation. It felt surreal. For years I had lived paycheck to paycheck, balancing diapers and deadlines. Now someone was offering me a building and a team to make something lasting. I didn't say yes right away. I walked the streets of my neighborhood, thinking about what it would mean to attach Gabe's name to something public, something permanent. I thought about what it would mean for Liam to grow up seeing his father, not only in framed photographs, but in the walls of a center designed for healing. Eventually I replied with a quiet yes and a list of requirements. I wanted the center to serve not just children, but single parents. I wanted art therapy rooms, free childcare for evening classes, and a rotating exhibition space for local artists who couldn't afford studio time. I wanted it to be what I didn't have when I needed it most. The announcement went live that summer. Local media covered it with polite enthusiasm, but the letters I received privately meant more. One came from a woman who had lost her partner during childbirth and wrote, "I've felt invisible for years. Seeing your work reminded me I'm still here. Another from a teenage boy who had been kicked out for being gay. He simply said, "Your story made me feel less broken." When we broke ground on the Carter Center for Creative Recovery, Liam wore a tiny hard hat and held the ceremonial shovel with both hands. My mother stood beside me, uncertain but trying. She asked if she could take a photo of me and Liam, and for the first time in a long time I handed her my phone without hesitation. My father sat nearby in a folding chair, thinner now, slower but present. He didn't speak much during the event, but when I approached him later he looked up and said, "He'd be proud of what you've built." "I am too." I just didn't know how to say it until now. I nodded. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was enough. I didn't need redemption from them anymore, but I had space now to let them try in their own quiet way. That fall, the Carter Center opened its doors. I gave the first tour to Liam, who ran through the halls like he already belonged there. In the main lobby hung a portrait of Gabe's smiling, camera slung over his shoulder, wind tossing his curls. Beneath it a small plaque read, "He saw the world differently," and left behind the courage to help others see it too. That evening, after we locked up and turned off the lights, I sat alone in the middle of the gallery space. I thought about the version of me who had once slept in her car behind a hospital. The girl who had no place to go, no voice left to raise, and no proof that the pain would one day mean something. And now, in that same silence, I smiled, not because it all made sense, but because I had stayed. And staying through everything was what built this. A few months after the Carter Center opened, Liam brought home a school project where he had to draw a family tree. He sat on the living room rug, tongue pressed to his upper lip as he carefully copied names. When he got to the space labeled grandparents, he paused. I watched him from the kitchen, waiting to see what he would do. Slowly, he wrote Peter and Eleanor Jessica in careful print, then looked over at me and asked, "Is it okay if I put them?" I didn't hesitate. I said yes. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about what he knew now. They had come. They had stayed. They hadn't erased Gabe. That was enough for Liam. And in some way it started to be enough for me too. That same week my father asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. We hadn't done that since I was 16. He chose a small place near the university hospital, quiet and unassuming with no memory attached to it. He wore a navy sweater I didn't recognize and moved slower than I remembered, his cane now less support than extension. When I arrived, he stood up and pulled the chair for me without speaking. We ordered tea. The kind of simple act that years ago we never thought to perform gently. He started by asking about Liam's school, about whether he liked reading more than math, whether he still played with that little red ukulele I had posted on social media once. I answered, simply giving him facts without opening old wounds. Then, between sips of peppermint tea, he said, "I've spent years replaying what I said that night. The way I slammed my hand on the table. The way your mother didn't stop me. I thought I was protecting the family, but I wasn't. I was protecting my image of control. And I lost my daughter for it." I didn't interrupt. I didn't soften. I let him sit in that silence. Then he added, "You shouldn't have had to do it alone. Not when you were already losing someone you loved." He looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen since childhood. His real eyes, not the guarded ones he wore in front of colleagues or the public. "I don't expect you to forget." "I wouldn't," he said. "But I hope maybe we can keep building something new, even if it's quiet." We sat there a little longer, no big breakthroughs, no theatrical embraces, but when we stood up to leave, he reached out, not for a handshake, but to steady me with the same gentleness I remembered from when I was small, and scraped my knee on the driveway. That night when I tucked Liam into bed, he asked me what forgiveness looked like. I told him it doesn't always look like one big moment. Sometimes it's just showing up, over and over. Until one day, you don't flinch anymore. A few weeks later, my mother invited Liam and me for dinner. It would be our first meal inside my childhood home since the day they asked me to leave. I hesitated, then agreed on one condition: that there be no pretending. No skipping over history like it was something that just happened in passing. She nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to pretend," she said softly. "Not anymore." When we arrived, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The white fence had chipped paint. The rose bushes in the front yard were overgrown. But the porch light was on, and through the window I saw a table set with mismatched plates and a pitcher of lemonade. Liam ran ahead, not carrying the weight of that threshold like I did. He was too young to remember it. I was not. But I stepped through anyway, this time on my own terms. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The same meal we used to have on Sundays when life was predictable and roles were clear. My father said grace without flourish, pausing for just a second longer than usual, before he ended with a quiet amen. There was no grand speech, No apology worked into the salad. Just effort, just presence. And for now, that was the only reconciliation I needed. After dinner, while Liam played quietly in the living room, my mother sat beside me and placed an envelope on the table. Inside were copies of every newspaper clipping she had saved over the years, small blurbs about my gallery shows, community awards, a profile the paper ran on me after the Carter Center opened. "I kept them in a shoebox in the back of the closet," she said. "It was all I had left of you that I didn't have to explain." She didn't cry. Neither did I. But something passed between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of mutual recognition. We had both lived in silence. Now we were learning to speak again. After that dinner, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like the sound of floorboards settling after a storm. We didn't become a close-knit family overnight. There were still silences, still moments when I caught my mother glancing away, when Liam brought up Gabe, still times when my father's pride slipped into formality, like armor. But they came to birthdays now. They brought small, thoughtful gifts. My mother knitted a sweater in Gabe's favorite color, and though she didn't say it was for him, I knew she had remembered. My father asked Liam about school, listened to his answers, and never once corrected him when he called himself half artist, half scientist. They never asked for more than I was willing to give. And for once, that was enough. At the Carter Center, Liam had become something of a fixture. Staff called him the hallway curator because he'd rearrange chairs or stand with a clipboard during open mic nights pretending to take notes. He started piano lessons with one of our therapy musicians and spent hours practicing in the quiet room next to my office. I'd often find him lost in his own compositions, eyes, half-closed fingers, stumbling over keys, with a kind of stubborn focus that reminded me so much of Gabe, it made my chest ache. One afternoon after I praised a small melody he'd written, he asked, "Do you think Dad would have liked it?" I looked at him and said without hesitation, he would have cried. And he didn't cry for much. That fall, Liam was nominated for a Youth Arts Fellowship, an intensive, year-long mentorship that paired young creatives with working professionals in their field. He didn't tell me he applied. One day I came home to find the acceptance letter folded neatly on the table next to a hand-drawn picture of a piano and a note that simply said, "I think I'm ready." I didn't ask what he meant. I knew. He had grown up watching me rebuild from ashes, and now he was ready to carry his own legacy forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. As part of the program, Liam was required to complete a final public performance and talk about the story behind his work. He chose to compose a piano piece titled Inheritance. For weeks I heard pieces of it drifting through the walls at night, soft runs, unfinished bridges, chords that hung in the air like questions. He asked to use a photo of Gabe for the projection background and requested that the event be held at the Carter Center's main hall. I agreed, quietly overwhelmed, not just by his decision, but by how far we had come to arrive at this moment. On the day of the performance, my parents arrived early. My mother wore the same brooch she had on the day she married my father, something I hadn't seen in decades. My father, now in a wheelchair, sat in the front row with a quiet dignity that reminded me of who he used to be before the fear and the pride hardened him. Ruby sat beside them, holding the event program like it was a piece of history, and in a way it was. Liam stepped on stage without hesitation. No nerves, no notes, just a quiet calm that seemed to stretch beyond his age. He introduced himself, thanked the mentors, and then, with no flourish, said, "This piece is for the father I never met, but still carry, and for the mother who carried us both." Then he played. The music was simple at first, tentative, curious, like walking into a memory you weren't sure you were ready to relive. But it built slowly, folding in layers of grief and grace, moving with the kind of control that only comes from someone who understands what it means to lose and still choose to keep creating. By the final chord, the room was silent, not from politeness, but from the collective weight of what they had just felt. Afterward, my father reached for my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a child. His grip was weaker now, but his eyes held steady. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "Not just for Liam. For all of us." I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Some grief lives so long inside you that by the time it's honored, tears feel like punctuation that the moment no longer requires. I looked at him and said, "We're not perfect, but at least we're here now." Later that evening, after the chairs were folded and the cake had been boxed up, Liam handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single page, a printout of his fellowship application. Under reason for applying, he had written, "Because my story didn't start the way most do. But maybe it can help someone else keep going." I folded the paper and placed it in the pocket of my coat next to the pendant Gabe had given me more than a decade earlier. A year after Liam's performance on a calm October morning, I found myself walking past the old university chapel, the one I had sat behind 15 years ago, hiding from the sound of my father's disappointment. The trees were losing their leaves slowly one by one, like pages falling from a book I wasn't quite ready to finish. In my hand was a letter addressed to myself, the last unopened note Gabe had left with Ruby the night he collapsed. For over a decade I had kept it sealed, afraid of what it might do to a heart that had worked so hard to hold itself together. But something had shifted in me. I wasn't the same woman anymore. I didn't need it to hurt to remember. I sat on a bench under a sugar maple and opened it. The letter was short, just a few lines in Gabe's messy handwriting written with the kind of rushed clarity that comes when you know time is running out. Sarah, I don't want you to live your life proving anything to anyone. Not your parents, not the world. You've already proven it to me. And to our son. That's enough. Let yourself have peace. I read it twice. Then I folded it back and held it between my palms. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I just breathed deeply and slowly for the first time in what felt like years. That night, I told Liam the full story, not just the pieces that protected him, but everything. About the day I was thrown out. About how scared I was. About the first night I held him alone, and how I made a promise out loud to a ceiling fan that I would never make him feel like an apology. He listened without interrupting, eyes, steady, body still. When I finished, he said, I already knew most of it. I just wanted to hear you say it. You're stronger than the story. I smiled because I finally believed it too. The Carter Center expanded the following spring. We added an outdoor courtyard and a small amphitheater for live performances. We hosted storytelling nights, grief circles, poetry slams, and quiet memorials for lost loved ones. We made space not just for healing but for legacy. Not the kind that's etched in granite, but the kind that lives in the people who carry your name, your voice, your lessons. Liam led a youth arts mentorship of his own that summer. His first student was a shy boy named Micah who reminded me so much of him at that age, brilliant, sensitive, and quietly resilient. My parents still came to events never expecting center stage, just sitting quietly in the third row clapping when appropriate, sometimes staying back to help clean up the chairs. I never asked them to do more. I didn't need them to rewrite the past. I just needed them to be different in the present. And slowly they were. One evening, I found a notebook my mother had left in my office. It was filled with letters she had written but never sent, some to me, some to Gabe, some to Liam. Each one a small attempt at making sense of her silence, of her regret. In one she wrote, I spent years trying to defend what I didn't understand, and in the process I lost the one person who could have taught me. I'm sorry I wasn't ready then. I am now. I closed the notebook, placed it in the center's memory box we kept in the library, and added a note of my own beside it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's letting the future be bigger than the past. On the 15th anniversary of Gabe's passing, we held a twilight ceremony at the courtyard. Liam played Inheritance again this time, without introduction, without nerves. Just music, just memory, just breath. Ruby lit a candle in the center's heart, and I stood next to her, hands warm from the flame. My father nodded from his seat. My mother squeezed my shoulder once. I didn't feel lost that night. I felt continuity. After everyone had gone, Liam and I sat on the bench under the same tree I had cried beneath 15 years ago. He leaned his head on my shoulder and whispered, Do you think he's proud I didn't answer right away? I looked at the flickering candles, the echo of music still dancing in the air, the glow of the community we built from brokenness. Then I said, I don't think pride is the right word. I think he's here. I think he stayed in every choice we made to love louder. And maybe that's the question that lingers now, for anyone listening, when everything is taken from you, your job, your home, your dignity, even your family, what part of yourself do you rebuild first? What do you choose to carry, and what do you finally put down?